stood at the observation deck of the warship Sentinel of Dawn and watched the stars drift past in silence. His scales were a deep green, the color of young officers who had not yet seen real combat. His claws tapped against the metal railing as he read the orders on his for the third time. He hoped the words would change. They did not. The High Command had authorized a joint military operation with humans. The word alone made his stomach turn. Humans. Every species in the Galactic Compact knew about them. Every child grew up hearing stories that kept them awake at night. The humans were called many things: the Mad Ones, the Persistence Predators, the Death Walkers. They were a young species from a small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy, and yet somehow they had become the most feared creatures in known space. Had studied them at the military academy. He knew the facts that made other species nervous. Humans were pursuit predators who could chase prey for days without stopping. Their bodies healed from wounds that would kill most species. They consumed poisons for pleasure and called them coffee and alcohol. They kept deadly animals in their homes and called them pets. They strapped themselves to explosive rockets and hurled themselves into the void for fun. And the most terrifying fact of all was that humans did not know when to quit. They did not surrender. They did not retreat. They fought until they won or until they died, and sometimes they kept fighting even after that. The mission briefing had explained the situation. The swarm had been moving through border space, consuming entire colonies. There were creatures with no mercy and no diplomacy. They ate everything in their path and moved on. A hive ship had been spotted near the system, and intelligence suggested it was preparing to harvest another civilian world. The fleet did not have enough ships to engage the hive directly, so they had requested assistance from Earth. The humans had agreed. They always agreed. That was another thing that made other species uneasy. Humans seemed eager to fight as if war was something they enjoyed, did not understand it. They fought when necessary, but they took no pleasure in violence. They valued survival above all else. The idea of seeking out danger seemed like madness. The human transport ship arrived 3 hours later, was ordered to meet the human squad at the docking bay and serve as their liaison during the mission. He walked through the corridors with his back straight and his expression calm, but his hearts were beating too fast. He had never met a human in person before. The docking bay doors opened and saw them for the first time. There were 4 of them, and they were smaller than he had expected. Humans were not physically impressive compared to most species. They had no scales, no claws, no natural armor. Their skin was soft and easily damaged. Their teeth were small. They moved on only 2 legs, which seemed inefficient, and yet something about them made one step backward. The first human approached him with a wide smile. He was a broad-shouldered male with short brown hair and eyes the color of warm earth. He extended his hand in the human greeting gesture. "Sergeant Jake Murray," he said, "you must be our contact. Good to meet you." Took the hand carefully. Human hands were strange things, with 5 flexible digits and no claws. The grip was firm and warm. He noticed scars on the human's knuckles, pale lines that spoke of old violence. I will be serving as your liaison during this operation." Jake Murray nodded and turned to introduce his team. The female with sharp gray eyes and auburn hair was Lieutenant Brooks, the squad's tactical officer. She looked at the way a predator looks at unfamiliar territory, measuring and calculating. The male with dark skin and an easy smile was Corporal Santos, the demolitions expert. He carried enough explosives on his belt to destroy a small building and seemed completely unbothered by this fact. The youngest was a female named Price, a medic with kind eyes and steady hands. She wore a patch on her shoulder that showed a red cross, the human symbol for healing. What struck most was how relaxed they seemed. They laughed with each other. They made jokes that he did not understand. Santos clapped him on the shoulder as if they were old friends, and the touch made flinch. "First time working with humans?" asked. Admitted that it was. "Do not worry," said. "We do not bite. Well, bites sometimes, but only when she is really angry." Brooks rolled her eyes but did not deny it. The briefing room was filled with officers and the four humans. A holographic display showed the hive ship in terrible detail. It was a living vessel, grown rather than built, with organic walls and a central core that pulsed like a heart. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. A small team would board the hive ship, fight their way to the engine core, plant explosives, and escape before detonation. Intelligence estimated fewer than 2,000 drones aboard. Jake Murray leaned back in his chair and grinned. Only 2,000. We have had worse odds on a Tuesday. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, felt a chill run through his scales. The human was not joking. He genuinely seemed to find the situation amusing. Brooke studied the holographic map with intense focus. She asked questions about patrol patterns, response times, and structural weak points. Her mind worked like a weapon, finding angles and opportunities that the officers had overlooked. Within an hour, she had revised the entire assault plan into something more efficient and more deadly. "We hit them fast," she said. "We keep moving. They are predictable. They follow their queen's pheromone commands without independent thought. That makes them dangerous in numbers but weak in adaptation. Humans adapt. That is our advantage." Watched her speak and understood something important. The humans were not brave because they did not understand danger. They were brave because they understood it completely and chose to face it anyway. They had looked at the odds and decided that victory was possible if they were willing to pay the price. As the briefing ended, Price approached. She offered him a small package wrapped in foil. "Chocolate," she said. "It is a human tradition to share food before battle. It is supposed to bring good luck." Accepted the gift and unwrapped it carefully. The brown substance inside smelled sweet and strange. He placed a small piece on his tongue and felt it melt. It was delicious. "Thank you," he said. Smiled. "We look out for our own, and for tonight, you are one of us." He did not know how to respond to that. No species had ever included a so easily before. The humans treated him not as an alien or an outsider, but as a comrade. It was confusing and uncomfortable and somehow wonderful. That night, as lay in his quarters and stared at the ceiling, he thought about the mission ahead. He thought about thee and their endless hunger. He thought about the humans and their strange courage. And he wondered if the stories about them were true. He would find out soon enough. The assault pods launched from the Sentinel of Dawn under cover of an asteroid field. There were 3 pods in total, each carrying a mixed team of soldiers and the human squad. Sat strapped into his seat beside Brooks, who was checking her rifle with the calm precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The pod shook as it navigated through the debris field, gripped his restraints and tried to control his breathing. His scales had gone pale, a sign of fear that he could not hide. He glanced at and saw that she was watching him. "First time in real combat?" she asked without judgment. Admitted that it was. He had trained for years at the academy. He had studied tactics and memorized their anatomy. He had scored high marks in every simulation, but he had never faced a living enemy that wanted to kill him. Nodded slowly. "They are fast, they swarm their targets and use numbers to overwhelm. They do not feel pain the way most species do, so wounding them means nothing. You have to kill them clean or they keep coming." She paused and met his eyes directly. "But they are predictable. They follow orders from their queen without question. They cannot think for themselves. Humans can. That is why we will win." Wanted to believe her. He wanted to have the same confidence that burned in her gray eyes. But his fear was a cold weight in his chest that would not move. The pod struck the hull of the hive ship with a violent crash. The breach cutters activated, carving through the organic metal with a shower of sparks and steam. The door blew open, and the squad poured into the corridor beyond. The interior of the hive ship was like nothing had ever seen. The walls were alive, pulsing with a sickly green light that came from within the tissue itself. The floor was soft and slightly warm, like walking on the skin of some enormous creature. The air was thick with a smell that made his stomach turn, a mixture of decay and something chemical that burned his nostrils. Jake Murray took point, his rifle sweeping the corridor ahead. Santos moved beside him and Brooks covered the rear. Price stayed in the middle with the soldiers, her medical kit ready. They moved in formation, each human covering the others with a trust that seemed absolute. Noticed how they communicated. They barely spoke. A glance, a hand signal, a slight nod of the head, that was enough. They moved as if they were parts of the same organism, each knowing exactly where the others would be. The soldiers tried to keep up, but they lacked the same coordination. The first patrol appeared around a bend in the corridor, saw them, and his body froze. They were more horrible than any image or simulation had prepared him for. 6 legs ending in curved claws, armored carapaces that gleamed like wet stone, mandibles that could cut through metal, compound eyes that reflected the green light in 1,000 fractured pieces. There were 8 of them, and they screamed when they saw the intruders. Jake Murray did not freeze. He moved forward with a sound that could only describe as a roar. He fired his weapon in short, controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. The first fell with a hole through its head. The second spun from a shot to the neck. A third lunged at Jake with its claws extended, and the human with impossible speed. His combat knife appeared in his hand as if by magic. He drove it into the joint where the creature's head met its body and twisted hard. The collapsed at his feet. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. 12 lay dead on the organic floor, their bodies leaking dark ichor. The humans were already checking their weapons and preparing to move on. They were not even breathing hard. Found himself on the ground. He did not remember falling. His rifle was still clutched in his hands, but he had not fired a single shot. The shame of it burned worse than any wound. Santos appeared beside him and offered a hand. "You okay there, friend?" Took the hand and let the human pull him to his feet. He could not meet's eyes. "I froze, I am sorry, I was useless." Shrugged as if it meant nothing. First combat is always the hardest. The fear hits you like a wall and your body just stops. It happens to everyone, even happened to me once. He grinned. The important thing is you are still here. You get a second chance. Most are not so generous. They pushed deeper into the ship. Forced himself to focus, to push the fear down into a small box in his mind. He watched the humans and tried to understand what made them different. They were not fearless. He could see the tension in their muscles, the way their eyes moved constantly. They felt the danger just as he did, but they did not let it control them. Another patrol. This time managed to fire his weapon. He did not hit anything, but at least he participated. Brooks took down 3 by herself, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost beautiful. Jake Murray fought like a force of nature, using his rifle, his knife, even his bare hands when it got too close. Santos threw a grenade into a side tunnel and sealed off potential reinforcements with a wall of fire. And Price did something that changed how saw humans forever. A soldier named went down with a claw wound in his leg. The blood was bright orange against the dark floor. Screamed in pain and terror, certain that he was going to die in this horrible place far from home. Moved to him without hesitation. She dropped to her knees beside him and opened her medical kit while we're still firing at them from down the corridor. "Hold still," she said in a calm voice. "I have got you. You are going to be fine." She worked with speed and precision, applying a tourniquet, injecting painkillers, sealing the wound with. Ichor splashed around her as the others fought, but she did not flinch. Her entire world had narrowed to the wounded soldier in front of her. Nothing else mattered. When she was done, she helped to his feet and supported his weight as they continued moving. She carried him for almost 100 meters until he could walk on his own. Watched this and felt something shift inside him. These humans were not monsters. They were not the bloodthirsty killers that the stories described. They were soldiers who cared deeply about the lives around them. They would walk into death itself for someone they had known for only hours. Jake Murray fell back to walk beside. "You did better that time. Kept your head, stayed in formation." "I barely contributed." "You stayed alive and did not get anyone else killed. In combat, that counts for a lot." Jake glanced at him with something that might have been respect. "The fear never goes away completely. You just learn to fight alongside it. Make it your ally instead of your enemy. Use it to keep you sharp." "Considered this. How do you do it? How do you walk into these situations knowing you might die?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "I think about the people I am protecting, my squad, the civilians we are saving, my family back home." He smiled, and there was warmth in it despite the horror around them. "Humans are not brave because we do not fear death. We are brave because there are things we love more than we fear dying." They reached a junction in the corridor. Brooks consulted her scanner and pointed toward the left passage. "The engine core is that way, about 300 meters." But between them and the core stood the central chamber of the hive, and inside that chamber was the queen. Jake Murray checked his ammunition and rolled his shoulders. "Well then, let us go say hello." The central chamber of the hive ship was a nightmare made real. Stood at the entrance and felt his courage crumble like dry sand. The room stretched before them like the inside of some vast organic cathedral. The walls curved upward into darkness, covered with pulsing veins and glistening membranes. Thousands of eggs lined the floor in neat rows, each one containing a drone waiting to be born. And in the center of it all sat the queen. She was enormous, 3 times the size of her warriors, with a body that combined the worst features of insect and nightmare. Her carapace was thick and dark, from battles that had happened before most species in the galaxy had learned to make fire. 6 massive limbs supported her bulk, and 2 smaller arms ended in claws that could tear through starship armor. Her head was crowned with antennae that twitched constantly, sending chemical signals to her children. When she turned to look at the intruders, her compound eyes reflected their images 1,000 times over. The original plan had been to avoid this chamber entirely. A service corridor was supposed to lead around it to the engine core, but the had collapsed that corridor, forcing the squad to find another route. And the only other route went straight through the Queen's domain. "We cannot do this," said one of the soldiers. His voice was shaking. "We must retreat, find another way." Brooks shook her head. "There is no other way. The charges must be placed in the engine core within the next 40 minutes, or the hive ship reaches the colony. 60,000 civilians will be harvested." She looked at each member of the squad in turn. "We go through." Jake Murray was already studying the chamber with tactical eyes. He pointed at positions around the room. 3 choke points. We can use the egg clusters as cover. If we move fast enough, we can cross before the Queen coordinates a full response. Santos pulled a grenade from his belt. "The eggs. If I hit them first, we reduce the number of future hostiles and create confusion." Price checked her medical kit and nodded. "I can keep people moving even if they take wounds. We just need to stay together." The soldiers looked at each other with something close to despair. Understood their fear because he shared it. But he also saw something else. He saw 4 humans who had looked at an impossible situation and decided that it was merely difficult. They were not pretending the danger did not exist. They were acknowledging it and choosing to face it anyway. "Stepped forward, I will fight with you." Jake clapped him on the shoulder, never doubted it for a second. Crouched down and used her knife to sketch a quick diagram on the organic floor. She assigned positions and firing lanes. She calculated response times and fallback points. Her mind worked with cold precision, finding opportunities in the chaos. When she was done, she looked up at the squad. "We have 7 minutes before the Queen can summon reinforcements from other parts of the ship. That is our window. Move fast, hit hard, do not stop for anything. If someone goes down, we grab them and keep moving. No one gets left behind." The assault began with throwing 3 grenades in quick succession. The explosions tore through clusters of eggs, sending pieces of shell and unborn flying through the air. The queen screamed, a sound that vibrated through the floor and made bones ache. Her warriors responded instantly, pouring out from alcoves in the walls and charging toward the intruders. Jake Murray led the push forward. He fired as he ran, each shot precise despite his movement. Two fell before they could close the distance. A third reached him with its claws extended, and Jake dropped into a slide that took him under the strike. He came up with his knife in hand and opened the creature's belly as he passed. Brooks moved like water, flowing between attacks that should have torn her apart. She never stayed in one place long enough to become a target. Her rifle spoke in steady bursts, and each burst claimed a life. When a warrior got too close, she used its own momentum against it, redirecting its charge into another attacker. Found himself in the middle of the formation, firing at anything that moved. His fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Adrenaline, maybe. Or perhaps it was the strange courage that seemed to radiate from the humans around him. He saw Santos grinning like a madman as he placed explosive charges on support pillars. He saw Price dragging a wounded to cover while firing her sidearm with perfect accuracy. He saw Jake take a hit to his ribs that would have killed her instantly, and he watched the human keep fighting as if he had not noticed. "Why do you keep going?" shouted over the chaos of battle. Jake laughed and there was blood on his teeth. "Because if I stop, my friends die. Simple as that." They were halfway across the chamber when the queen decided to join the fight personally. She rose from her position with a grace that belied her massive size. Her warriors parted around her like water flowing around a stone. She screamed again, and this time the sound carried chemical commands that drove her children into a frenzy. The drones stopped caring about their own survival. They threw themselves at the squad in waves, sacrificing themselves to slow the advance. Saw a drone tackle a soldier and drag him down. He saw another soldier fall with a claw through his chest. The squad was being overwhelmed. They had killed dozens of, but there were always more. And then Brooks did something that would remember for the rest of his life. She broke cover. She ran directly at the queen, ignoring the claws and mandibles that slashed at her from every direction. Her rifle emptied, and she dropped it without slowing. A claw caught her arm and drew blood, but she kept running. Another struck her leg, and she stumbled but did not fall. She was screaming something, words in human language that did not understand but that sounded like defiance itself. The queen turned to face this tiny creature that dared approach her. Her mandibles opened wide, revealing a mouth filled with rows of cutting teeth. She lunged forward to bite in half. Was ready. She pulled a grenade from her belt, armed it, and threw it directly into the queen's open mouth. Then she threw herself aside with every ounce of strength she had left. The explosion was muffled by the queen's body, but the results were not. The queen's head simply came apart, spraying ichor and tissue across the chamber. Her massive body swayed for a terrible moment and then collapsed with a crash that shook the floor. The effect on them was immediate and devastating. Without their queen's pheromone commands, they had no direction. Some continued attacking but without coordination. Others simply stopped moving, standing in place like broken machines. Still others turned on each other, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. Jake Murray did not waste the opportunity. Move, engine core now. They ran. Was on the ground, her leg twisted at a wrong angle, her face pale with pain. But she was smiling. Santos scooped her up without breaking stride and carried her over his shoulder. Price stayed close, already preparing to treat the wounds. "Timer is still running," said through gritted teeth. "Get to the core." They crossed the rest of the chamber in minutes. The surviving were too disoriented to mount an effective defense. Jake led them through a side passage that opened into a vast space dominated by the ship's organic engine. The core pulsed with bioluminescent light, a living heart that pumped energy through the vessel. Sat down gently and began pulling charges from his pack. "Cover me. This will take 3 minutes." Jake and took positions at the entrance. They were beginning to recover, their primitive brains adjusting to life without their queen. Soon they would come. "Thank you," said quietly. Jake glanced at him. "For what?" "For showing me what courage looks like." Jake shook his head. "Courage is not complicated. It is just choosing to protect the people who matter even when it costs you everything." He paused and smiled. "You fought well today. You are a warrior now. Act like one." Finished planting the charges. Set for 15 minutes. That is our window to reach the extraction point. They gathered and began the long run back to the assault pod. Behind them, the engine core continued to pulse, unaware of the death that was counting down inside it. The retreat was a nightmare painted in blood and fire, ran through corridors that seemed to twist and shift around him, the organic walls pulsing with angry red light. The death of the queen had thrown the hive into chaos, but chaos did not mean safety. They were everywhere, their movements erratic and unpredictable without central command. Some attacked anything that moved. Others fled in mindless panic. And somewhere behind them, something far worse was waking up. Santos carried Brooks on his back, her broken leg bouncing with every step. She had passed out from the pain, her face pale and slick with sweat. Price ran beside them, one hand pressed against a wound on side that was bleeding too fast. The soldiers that remained numbered only 5, down from the original 12. The rest had fallen in the Queen's chamber or in the corridors that followed. Jake Murray led from the front, his rifle never still. He moved through the ship like he had been born there, reading the organic architecture with instincts that seemed supernatural. He called out warnings before dangers appeared. He found shortcuts that saved precious seconds, and when blocked their path, he cleared it with a violence that left breathless. The timer in his helmet display showed 11 minutes remaining. They rounded a corner and found the corridor ahead collapsed. Organic tissue had sealed the passage completely, too thick to cut through quickly. Jake cursed under his breath and consulted his scanner. "Alternate route through the cargo bay. It adds 4 minutes." "We do not have 4 minutes," said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were desperate. Jake did not hesitate. "Then we move faster." The cargo bay was vast and dark, filled with pods that contained harvested biological material. Tried not to look too closely at the shapes inside the pods. Some of them were roughly humanoid. Some of them were still moving. They did not simply kill their prey. They stored it for later consumption. The colonists from previous raids were being kept alive in a state worse than death. They were halfway across the bay when the Praetorians found them. Had heard of Praetorians but had never seen one. They were the Queen's elite guard, kept in hibernation until needed most, larger than normal warriors with armor thick enough to stop rifle fire and claws that could cut through bulkhead doors. There were 6 of them, and they moved with a purpose that the other lacked. The Queen was dead, but her final command had been clear: kill the intruders, protect the hive. The first Praetorian hit their formation like a missile. It scattered the soldiers and went straight for, sensing that he carried the most valuable target. Dropped as gently as he could and brought his rifle up, but the Praetorian was too fast. Its claw caught his weapon and shattered it. The backswing would have taken his head off, but Jake was there, driving into the creature's side and forcing it off balance. The battle became a blur of motion and noise, fired at anything that was not human, or his shots bounced off Praetorian armor, but he kept firing anyway. Dragged behind a cargo pod and stood over her with a pistol, her face set in determination. 2 soldiers went down, then a third. Their screams were short and terrible. Jake fought like nothing had ever seen. He had abandoned his rifle and was using his knife, getting close enough to find the gaps in Praetorian armor. He killed one by driving his blade through its eye. He killed another by somehow getting beneath it and cutting the tendons of its legs. But even he could not be everywhere at once. Pulled out his last grenade and armed it, everyone down. The explosion killed 2 Praetorians and wounded a third, but it also collapsed part of the ceiling, blocking the path behind them. They could only go forward now. The timer showed 7 minutes remaining. They ran. Jake carried now, having taken her from where had sheltered her. His arm was bleeding from a deep cut, but he did not slow down. Supported a wounded soldier who could barely walk. Brought up the rear, firing at shadows that might or might not contain enemies. The assault pod was ahead. Could see its breach point in the hull, the torn metal edges still glowing from the entry cutters. Safety was only 50 meters away. They were going to make it. And then the last Praetorian appeared. It rose from beneath a pile of debris where the grenade had buried it. One of its arms was destroyed, and ichor leaked from cracks in its carapace. But it was still alive, and it was directly between them and the pod. Jake sat down and stepped forward. His knife was still in his hand, covered in blood. He looked at the Praetorian and then back at his squad. "Get them out," he said to. "I will hold it here." Stared at him. "That is suicide. You cannot defeat a Praetorian alone." "I do not have to defeat it, I just have to slow it down." Jake smiled, and there was no fear in his expression, only peace. The pod can only carry so many, and someone needs to make sure you all get clear. Tried to protest. "Sarge, no, we can find another way." "There is no other way, there is never another way. That is why they send people like us." Jake looked at each of them in turn. His gaze lingered on who had tears streaming down her face. "Tell my mom I went out fighting, and name your kid after me if it is a boy." He turned to and gripped his shoulder with one bloody hand. "You understand now, do you not? This is what we are. This is why the galaxy fears us. Not because we are strong, not because we are fast, but because there is nothing we will not do for the people we love." The Praetorian charged. Jake Murray charged to meet it. Wanted to stay. Every part of him screamed that he should fight beside this human who had become something like a friend, but grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the pod. Was already inside, strapping into a seat. The surviving soldiers scrambled through the breach. The pod's doors began to close. Through the narrowing gap, watched Jake Murray fight his final battle. The human was wounded in a dozen places. His left arm hung useless at his side. Blood covered half his face from a cut on his scalp, but he kept moving, kept striking, kept finding ways to hurt the creature that towered over him. His rifle was empty. He threw it at the Praetorian's face. His pistol ran dry after 6 shots. He dropped it and drew his knife again. The Praetorian caught him with a glancing blow that sent him sprawling, but he rolled with it and came up still fighting. The last thing saw before the doors sealed was Jake Murray rising to his feet one final time. His knife was gone, lost somewhere in the darkness. But he raised his fists anyway. And he screamed something in human language, a war cry that echoed through the metal halls even as the pod's engines fired. The assault pod tore free from the hive ship's hull and accelerated toward the distant stars. Behind them, the organic vessel hung in space like a wound in reality. 90 seconds later, the explosives detonated. The hive ship's engine core ruptured in a cascade of failures that consumed the entire vessel. Fire bloomed in the void, brilliant and terrible. Secondary explosions tore through the structure as stored biological material ignited. Within moments, there was nothing left but debris and silence. Jake Murray was inside when it happened. He had never tried to escape. He had known from the moment he made his choice that he would not survive, and he had made that choice anyway because that was who he was. Price wept silently, her hand pressed against the viewport. Santos sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Brooks was still unconscious, unaware that the man who had carried her to safety was gone. Did not weep, did not have tear ducts, but he felt something break inside him, something that would never fully heal. He had known Jake Murray for less than a day, and yet the human had treated him as a brother, had trusted him, had died so that he could live. The pod flew on through the darkness, and began to understand why the entire galaxy feared humans. The Sentinel of Dawn hung in orbit above Prime, its hull from the debris field they had passed through during the retreat. Medical shuttles moved between the warship and the planet below, carrying survivors to proper hospitals. The mission had been a success. 60,000 civilians would live because of what they had done, but success had come at a terrible price. Stood in the observation deck and watched the stars. His scales had darkened since the mission, shifting from the bright green of inexperience to a deeper shade that spoke of battles survived, changed color as they aged and as they endured trauma. He would never be the same officer who had read those orders 3 days ago and felt only fear. The debriefing had taken hours. Intelligence officers had asked hundreds of questions about the hive ship's interior, the tactics, the Queen's capabilities. They had recorded every detail for future operations, but had noticed that the officers asked very few questions about the humans. They seemed almost afraid to hear the answers. The surviving human squad had been given quarters aboard the ship. Brooks was in medical, her leg set and healing thanks to advanced technology. She would walk again within weeks. Santos had refused treatment for his arm until he was certain that every soldier had been cared for first. Price had spent the first 12 hours after their return in silence, staring at nothing. Found them in the ship's common area, sitting together in a small circle. They had pushed the furniture into a configuration that placed them facing each other, a human habit that prioritized group connection over efficiency. Was telling a story about something Jake had done during a mission years ago. The story involved a malfunctioning vehicle, a very large animal, and a bet that Jake had somehow won despite impossible odds. Laughed at the ending, and the sound was wet with grief but genuine. They looked up when approached, gestured for him to join them, and he settled into a chair that was too small for his frame. "We were talking about Jake," said, remembering the good parts. Nodded slowly. "I did not know him long, but he left an impression on me that I do not think will fade." Wiped her eyes. He was like that, could meet someone for 5 minutes and make them feel like they had known him their whole life. He collected friends the way other people collect souvenirs. "He talked about you before the mission," said. Her voice was rough from disuse and pain medication. "Said you had good instincts. Said you would make a fine soldier someday if you could get past your fear." Felt something tighten in his chest. "He died for us, for the mission, for people he barely knew." "He died because that is who he was," said quietly. "Every human who puts on a uniform knows the deal. We might not come home, but the people we protect will." Jake understood that better than anyone. He never hesitated when it mattered. Reached out and took clawed hand in her small human fingers. The touch was strange but not unpleasant. Jake used to say that courage is not about being fearless. It is about being afraid and doing the job anyway, about choosing to act even when every part of you wants to run. She met his eyes with an intensity that made him want to look away. "You were afraid today, but you did the job. That makes you one of us now." One of us? The word settled into his mind and refused to leave. He had been included, not as an ally or a subordinate or a convenient asset, but as a member of their family. Humans did that, he realized. They expanded their definition of family to include anyone who fought beside them, anyone who shared their dangers and their losses. In the days that followed, began writing his report to the High Command. It was required of all officers who participated in joint operations with other species. He described the tactical details with precision. The enemy's strength, the mission parameters, the timeline of the assault. He recorded the names of the fallen and the nature of their deaths. He documented the destruction of the Hive ship and the successful defense of Prime. But he also wrote something else, something that was not required. He wrote about the humans. He wrote about a species that had evolved on a death world, a planet filled with predators and poisons and disasters that would have destroyed most civilizations before they left their caves. He wrote about how that crucible had forged them into something remarkable. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest or the most technologically advanced, but they had something that other species lacked. Humans had will. They had a refusal to accept defeat that bordered on madness. They had the ability to look at impossible odds and see opportunities instead of obstacles. They formed bonds with other species as easily as breathing, treating strangers as comrades after a single shared battle. They laughed in the face of death, not because they did not understand it, but because they had chosen to live fully until the very end. Wrote about Jake Murray. He described how the sergeant had led his squad with calm confidence, how he had fought with skill and courage, how he had sacrificed himself without hesitation to save others. He recorded Jake's final words and tried to capture the meaning behind them. And he wrote about what he had learned. The humans are not to be feared because they are dangerous. They are to be feared because they make those around them dangerous too. They inspire. They lead. They charge into the darkness and somehow convince others to follow. They die so that others may live, and in dying, they create legends that echo through generations. He paused and considered his next words carefully. If the Empire ever considers humans as enemies, I urge the High Command to reconsider. Not because we would lose the war, though I believe we would, but because we would lose something far more precious. We would lose the chance to fight beside them. We would lose the chance to become better because of their example. The report was submitted through official channels. Expected it to be filed away and forgotten, one document among millions in the vast archives of the Empire. But something unexpected happened. Copies of the report began to circulate. Other officers read it and shared it with their peers. The word spread through the military like ripples in a pond. Within weeks, its account had reached the High Command itself. Within months, it had leaked beyond space and into the wider galactic compact. Species who had whispered about humans in fear began to whisper about them in hope. The story of Sergeant Jake Murray became something larger than one soldier's sacrifice. It became a symbol of what humans represented. Not violence for its own sake, but violence in service of protection. Not recklessness, but calculated courage. Not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Returned to active duty with a new rank and a new understanding of himself. He carried Jake Murray's name in his heart, a reminder of what it meant to truly commit to something larger than oneself. He trained other soldiers and taught them what he had learned. Some of them struggled to believe it at first. The old stories about humans were hard to shake. But had seen the truth with his own eyes. He had fought beside humans. He had bled beside them and mourned beside them. He had watched a man choose death so that others could live. The galaxy still feared humans. That fear was appropriate. They were the most dangerous species that had ever reached the stars, but fear was no longer the only emotion they inspired. Because had learned something that changed everything. He had learned that the opposite of fear was not courage. The opposite of fear was love, and humans had more love in them than any species he had ever known. Love for their families, their friends, their comrades. Love for strangers they had never met and would never know. Love strong enough to walk into the darkness and trust that they would find a way through. That was why the galaxy feared them, not because they were monsters, but because they were something far more dangerous. They were heroes, and anyone who fought beside them learned what it meant to be one too.